There's a special kind of fear that comes from being truly alone in the wilderness, when you realize there's no one around to hear you scream, and the darkness between the trees could hide anything. Welcome to Night Encounters. In this video, you will hear 3 terrifying true stories from those who encountered disturbing situations while alone in the woods. These are allegedly true accounts shared by people who experienced something they can never forget. Before we begin, please note that these stories contain descriptions of fear, potential danger, and unsettling situations. Listener discretion is advised. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The Watcher in the Pines, by Sharon. This happened in the summer of 2018, when I was 23 years old. I had just graduated college and was feeling pretty burned out from 4 years of constant stress and deadlines. My parents owned about 15 acres of wooded property in northern Michigan, and they'd always let me camp out there when I needed to clear my head. The woods backed up to state forest land, so it felt incredibly isolated and peaceful. I decided to spend a long weekend out there by myself. Just me, a tent, some supplies, and my thoughts. I'd done this maybe a dozen times before without incident. The spot I always used was about a half-mile hike from my parents' house, in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees. During the day, sunlight filtered through the branches in these beautiful golden shafts. At night, the canopy was so thick you could barely see the stars. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late July. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze that kept the bugs manageable. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the rest of the daylight reading and just enjoying the quiet. There's something about being that far from civilization that just resets you, you know? No phone signal, no internet, no noise except wind and birds. As the sun started to set, I got my fire going. I made some dinner, nothing fancy, just hot dogs and beans cooked over the flames. The fire crackled and popped, and I remember feeling so content, so at peace. I was planning to stay up late, maybe do some stargazing if the clouds cleared. That's when I heard it. A voice. It was distant, maybe a couple hundred yards away, coming from deeper in the woods. At first, I thought I might have imagined it. But then I heard it again. It sounded like someone calling out, but I couldn't make out the words. Just this faint, echoing sound that seemed to drift between the trees. I sat up straighter, straining to hear. The voice came again. This time, I was sure. It was definitely someone yelling, but in this weird, almost sing-song way. Not like they were in distress, but not like a normal conversation either. My stomach tightened a little. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. This was private property, and the state forest trails didn't come anywhere near this area. I'd never encountered another person during any of my previous camping trips. I waited, listening. The voice stopped. 5 minutes of silence. 10 minutes. Just the fire crackling and the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone lost? Maybe it was just sound carrying strangely through the trees, and they were actually much farther away than I thought? I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Then I heard footsteps. Not close, but not far enough away either. The distinct sound of branches snapping under someone's weight, moving through the underbrush. My heart started pounding. The footsteps weren't hurried. They were slow, deliberate, like whoever it was wasn't worried about being heard. I stood up from my camping chair, suddenly very aware of how exposed I was. The firelight made me visible for probably 50 feet in every direction, But beyond that circle of light, the woods were pitch black. I couldn't see anything, but someone out there could definitely see me. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Silence. My mouth went dry. I don't know why, but something about the sudden stop was more frightening than if they'd kept walking. It felt deliberate, like whoever was out there was now watching me, deciding what to do. I waited for maybe a full minute, just standing there by the fire, listening so hard my ears were ringing. Nothing. No response, no more footsteps, no voice. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a deer. Deer can sound surprisingly human-like sometimes, right? But I knew that wasn't true. I'd heard deer in these woods before. That was not a deer. I sat back down, but I couldn't relax. Every shadow beyond the firelight seemed to move. Every sound made me jump. I kept telling myself that if someone was lost or needed help, they would have responded when I called out. But they didn't. They just stopped. About 20 minutes later, I heard the voice again. This time it was clearer, closer, and I could make out a word. "Hello." Long drawn out, almost playful. It made my skin crawl. This wasn't someone lost. This wasn't someone looking for help. This was someone trying to get a reaction from me. I stood up again, my hands shaking now. "Who's there? What do you want?" No answer. But then, off to my left, I heard movement again. Closer this time, maybe 30 yards away. Then to my right, more movement. It sounded like there was more than one person circling around my campsite. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. But run where? Back to my parents' house was a half-mile through dark woods on an unmarked trail. I had a flashlight, but using it would make me an even easier target. My tent offered no protection. I was completely vulnerable. I grabbed a long stick from my firewood pile, the biggest one I could find. It wasn't much, but it was something. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "I've called someone," I shouted into the darkness, lying. "They're on their way. You need to leave." The movement stopped again. More silence. But I could feel it now, the weight of eyes watching me. Multiple people, somewhere just beyond the reach of the firelight, standing perfectly still. I've never felt more terrified in my entire life. In that moment, I wasn't thinking rationally anymore. I was pure adrenaline and fear. Then I heard something that still haunts me. Laughter. Quiet, muffled laughter from at least 2 different directions. Like this was all a game to them. Like my fear was entertaining. That's when I ran. I didn't think, I just bolted. I grabbed my flashlight and ran straight back toward my parents' house, leaving everything behind. The tent, my supplies, my backpack. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from those voices, that laughter. The trail was hard to follow in the dark, even with the flashlight. Branches whipped at my face and caught on my clothes. I stumbled over roots, scraped my hands, catching myself. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the woods, following me. They were laughing louder now, whooping and calling out. "Come back, we just want to talk." I ran faster, my lungs burning. I fell once, hard, and the flashlight went flying. I scrambled in the dirt to find it, my hands frantically searching, certain that any second someone would grab me from behind. My fingers closed around it, and I was up and running again before I even turned it back on. I don't know how long it took me to reach my parents' house. It felt like forever. When I finally burst out of the tree line into their backyard, I was sobbing, gasping for air. I ran to the back door and pounded on it, screaming for my dad. He opened the door within seconds, and I practically fell into the house. Between gasps, I tried to explain what happened. He grabbed his rifle and his own flashlight and called the police. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, about 20 minutes later, my dad and I were standing in the lit backyard watching the tree line. We hadn't seen or heard anything since I got out of the woods. The deputies took my statement and then insisted on going out to my campsite with my dad. I refused to go with them. I sat in the kitchen with my mom, shaking, drinking hot tea that I couldn't even taste. They came back an hour later. They found my campsite. The tent was still there. My backpack was still there. The fire had burned down to coals. But everything was intact. Nothing stolen, nothing destroyed. They said they searched the immediate area but didn't find any sign of anyone else. No tracks, no trash, nothing. They seemed skeptical, I could tell. One of them suggested maybe I'd heard teenagers from town messing around, trying to scare a lone camper. Maybe I'd overreacted. My dad got angry at that, told them his daughter knew these woods and wouldn't panic over nothing. But here's the thing that still bothers me. The thing I didn't mention in my statement because I didn't even notice it until the next day. My dad went back out in the daylight to retrieve my stuff. When he brought everything back, I was going through my backpack and I found something that hadn't been there before. A photograph. It was a Polaroid, kind of faded and old looking. It showed the exact clearing where I'd been camping. Same fire pit, same trees. But in the photo, standing just barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a person. Just a silhouette, too dark and blurry to make out any features. But they were there, watching whoever took the photo. Written on the white border at the bottom, in pencil, were 4 words. "You're not alone here." I have no idea when someone put that in my backpack, whether they'd snuck into my tent while I was sitting by the fire, or if they'd done it later, after I ran. The idea that someone was that close to me, close enough to open my bag and leave that photo without me knowing, makes me feel sick. I never went back to those woods. My parents eventually sold that property a few years later. I didn't tell them about the photograph. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to scare them more. Maybe part of me worried they wouldn't believe me. I still have the photo. I keep it in a drawer. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, trying to see more detail in that dark figure, trying to understand who they were and what they wanted. But I think I'm better off not knowing. Story 2. The Hermit's Cabin. By Arthur. This happened in October of 2020 during the pandemic. I was living in Portland at the time, and like everyone else, I was going stir crazy from being cooped up in my apartment. I'd been working from home for 7 months straight, barely seeing anyone, and I needed to get out of the city for a while. I'm an experienced hiker and backpacker. I've done multi-day trips all over the Pacific Northwest, so I planned a solo 4-day trek in the Cascade Mountains on a trail I'd never done before. It was supposed to be moderately difficult, about 40 miles total, with some decent elevation gain. I started on a Wednesday morning. The weather forecast looked good, cool but clear. The first day of hiking was perfect. The fall colors were incredible, the trail was well maintained, and I only saw a couple of other hikers heading in the opposite direction. By evening, I'd made it to a designated camping area about 12 miles in. I set up my tent, made dinner, and slept like a rock. Day 2 was when things started feeling off. The trail got less maintained the further I went, more overgrown, harder to follow in places. I was using a GPS app on my phone to make sure I stayed on track, but the trail on the ground didn't always match up with the line on my map. Nothing too concerning, just slightly annoying. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed the trail markers had stopped. These trails usually have small metal tags nailed to trees every 100 yards or so to help you know you're going the right way. But I realized I hadn't seen one in a while. I checked my GPS. According to it, I was still on the trail. But something felt wrong. I kept going, figuring I'd hit the next marker eventually. But after another hour of hiking, I still hadn't seen one. The trail was getting even more overgrown, to the point where I was really just following what looked like a slight path through the underbrush. That's when I saw the cabin. It was set back about 50 feet from the trail, tucked into a small clearing surrounded by old-growth fir trees. I almost walked right past it without noticing because it was so weather-beaten and dark. The wood was gray and mossy, the roof sagged in places, and the single window I could see was covered with dirt and grime. I stopped, confused. This wasn't marked on my map. There were no structures supposed to be anywhere along this trail. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. My first thought was that maybe it was an old ranger station or something. The kind of thing that gets built and then forgotten when the trail gets rerouted or stops being maintained. It happens sometimes in remote areas. I was curious, so I walked closer. The cabin was small, maybe 12 by 12 feet, made of rough-hewn logs. There was a door, slightly ajar, hanging crooked on rusty hinges. The clearing around it was eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, just this heavy silence that made me uneasy. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" I don't know why. The place obviously looked abandoned, but it felt like the polite thing to do. No answer, just my voice echoing slightly and then nothing. I approached the door and pushed it open further. It scraped against the floor with this long, grating screech that set my teeth on edge. Inside was dim, the only light coming from the dirty window and the open door. It smelled musty and damp, with an underlying scent of something rotten. The cabin was one room. There was a rusted metal bed frame in one corner, with a stained, moldy mattress. A small wood stove sat in the opposite corner, pipe going up through the ceiling. A rough wooden table and a single chair. Some shelves on the wall holding old cans and jars covered in dust. But what really caught my attention was the wall opposite the door. It was covered in writing, scratched into the wood, carved with something sharp. Words and phrases overlapping each other, going in all directions. Some of it was illegible, but I could make out certain things. They won't leave. Watching, always watching. Can't sleep. They come at night. No escape. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just some abandoned cabin. Someone had been living here, and they'd clearly lost their mind. Or something had driven them to madness. I backed out of the cabin quickly, my heart starting to race. The silence of the clearing suddenly felt oppressive, threatening. I looked around at the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching me. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS to see how far off trail I'd actually wandered. But my phone had no signal, and when I opened the GPS app, it wouldn't load. The little spinning wheel just kept going and going. A wave of anxiety hit me. I looked back at the trail, or what I thought was the trail. The overgrown path I'd been following continued on past the cabin, disappearing into the trees. But looking at it now, I wasn't sure if it was actually a trail or just a natural gap in the vegetation. I decided to retrace my steps, go back the way I'd come until I hit a definite trail marker. I'd lost maybe an hour to this detour, but that was fine. Better to lose time than get completely lost. I turned my back on the cabin and started walking back. I'd only gone about 20 feet when I heard it. A sound from inside the cabin. A soft shuffling, like footsteps on the wooden floor. I froze. My blood turned to ice. I'd been in that cabin less than 2 minutes ago. It was empty. I was sure it was empty. The shuffling stopped. Then I heard the door creak, like someone was pushing it open further. I didn't look back. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to walk quickly, steadily, not letting panic take over completely. Running blindly through the woods would just get me more lost. Behind me, I heard footsteps in the clearing, following me. I walked faster, my hand gripping the strap of my backpack. The footsteps behind me matched my pace, not closing the distance, but not falling behind either, just following. I risked a glance over my shoulder. There was someone there, maybe 30 feet back, a figure, tall and thin, moving between the trees. They were wearing dark clothes and I couldn't make out their face, but they were definitely following me. My breathing got shallow. I walked faster, my eyes scanning for any recognizable landmark, any sign that I was getting back to the actual trail. The figure kept pace, never getting closer, never falling behind, silent except for the footsteps. I don't know how long this went on. 20 minutes? 30? It felt like hours. My legs were burning, my heart pounding. I wanted to run, but the terrain was too rough, too treacherous. I'd twist an ankle or worse. Finally, I saw it. A trail marker nailed to a tree up ahead, the bright metal reflecting light. I'd found the real trail. I practically sprinted the last 20 yards to that marker. When I reached it, I spun around, ready to confront whoever had been following me, to demand to know what they wanted. The forest behind me was empty. No figure, no movement, no sound. Just trees and underbrush and dappled sunlight, like there'd never been anyone there at all. I stood there for a full minute, scanning the woods, trying to catch any glimpse of where they'd gone. Nothing. They'd vanished. My hands were shaking. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, that the creepy cabin and the isolation had made me paranoid. But I knew what I'd seen. Someone had been following me. I checked my GPS. It was working again now that I was back on the actual trail. I was about 2 miles off course. The cabin and that weird overgrown path weren't on my map at all. I made a decision right then. I was done with this hike. 4 days alone in the woods suddenly seemed like a terrible idea. I checked the map for the fastest way out. There was a trailhead about 8 miles ahead that connected to a Forest Service road. If I pushed hard, I could make it before dark. I hiked those 8 miles in record time. I barely stopped, just kept moving. I kept checking behind me every few minutes, but I didn't see the figure again, didn't hear anything unusual. When I finally reached the trailhead parking area, there were 2 other cars there. I've never been so relieved to see other people in my life. A young couple was just getting out of their car, preparing to start a hike. They looked at me funny. I probably looked like hell, sweaty and pale and wild-eyed. I got to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, just breathing, letting the reality of being safe sink in. Then I drove straight home, didn't even stop except for gas. That night, I tried to research the cabin. I searched online for any information about structures in that area, checked old Forest Service records, looked at historical maps. I couldn't find anything. It was like that cabin didn't exist. A week later, I was going through my backpack to clean it out. I found something in the outer pocket that made my blood run cold. A small piece of paper folded up tight. I didn't remember putting it there. I unfolded it with shaking hands. It was a note, written in pencil, in rough, scrawled handwriting. You came to my home. Only polite I visit yours. Below the words was my home address. I moved out of that apartment within a month. I don't know if whoever wrote that note actually knew where I lived, or if they'd somehow gotten it from something in my backpack, or if it was just a lucky guess meant to scare me. But I wasn't taking chances. I never went back to that area. I still hike, but never alone anymore. And I always stay on the marked trail. Sometimes I wonder who lived in that cabin, or who lives there now. What drove them to scratch those words into the walls? What they were running from, or what was watching them? And I wonder if they're still out there in those woods, following other hikers who wander too far off the path. I prefer not to think about it. Story 3. The Hunting Blind. By Sophia. I'm not much of an outdoors person. I never have been. But in the fall of 2019, my boyfriend at the time, Tyler, convinced me to go on a weekend camping trip with him. He was really into hunting and camping and all that, and he wanted to share it with me. He'd been talking about this spot for weeks, a place his family had been going to for years. Private land owned by his uncle, deep in the Missouri Ozarks. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to make him happy. He was so excited about it. We drove out on a Friday afternoon in late October. The drive took about 3 hours from where we lived in St. Louis. The last 40 minutes were on progressively smaller roads until we were on a dirt track barely wide enough for Tyler's truck. The property was beautiful, I'll give it that. Rolling hills covered in oak and hickory trees, just starting to turn those brilliant fall colors. A small creek running through a valley. Tyler's uncle had a small hunting cabin on the property, but Tyler wanted us to camp in a tent like he did when he was a kid. More authentic, he said. We set up camp in a flat area near the creek. By the time we had the tent up and our gear organized, the sun was setting. Tyler made a fire and cooked dinner. Hot dogs and baked beans, classic camping food. It was actually kind of nice, peaceful. I was starting to think maybe I'd been wrong about camping. After dinner, Tyler asked if I wanted to see his old hunting blind. He'd built it with his dad when he was 15, about 12 years ago, and he was curious if it was still standing. It was only about a 10-minute walk from our campsite. I wasn't thrilled about hiking in the dark, but he was so enthusiastic that I agreed. We grabbed flashlights and headed out. The hunting blind was up a hill, overlooking a small clearing where deer apparently liked to feed in the early morning. Tyler explained it to me as we walked. It was basically a small elevated platform in a tree, with walls and a roof to hide from the deer's view. You'd sit up there before dawn and wait for them to come into range. When we found it, I was surprised it was still there and mostly intact. It was about 8 feet off the ground, built between 2 large oak trees. Wooden platform, walls made of old plywood, a shingled roof that was missing a few shingles, but still mostly whole. A rough ladder made of 2x4s nailed to one of the trees led up to it. Tyler climbed up first to check if it was safe. I heard him moving around on the platform, testing the boards. "It's a little weathered, but still solid," he called down. "Come on up." The view is awesome. I climbed the ladder carefully, testing each rung. When I got to the top and pulled myself onto the platform, I had to admit he was right. Even in the dark, even with just our flashlights, you could see across the clearing to the valley beyond. The moon was rising, nearly full, casting everything in this silvery light. The blind was cramped, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, just big enough for 2 people to sit or crouch. There was an old wooden folding chair in one corner, rotted and broken. Empty shotgun shell casings littered the floor. It smelled musty and old. Tyler pointed out different features, telling me stories about hunts he'd been on with his dad and uncle. He was happy, nostalgic. I tried to share his enthusiasm, even though sitting in a cramped old tree blind wasn't really my idea of fun. We'd been up there for maybe 10 minutes when I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. On the wall behind the broken chair, someone had carved words into the plywood. I pointed my flashlight at it. "The hell is that?" I asked. Tyler looked where I was pointing. The words were rough, carved deep. "She watches at night." He frowned. "That's weird. That wasn't here before." "Before when?" "You haven't been here in years, right?" "Well, yeah, but..." He ran his finger over the carving. "This doesn't look old. The wood isn't darkened like it would be if this was carved years ago. This is recent." A chill ran down my spine. "Who else comes out here?" "Just family. My uncle, my dad sometimes, my cousins. But none of them would carve something like that." We both went quiet, thinking. The playful mood from earlier had evaporated. "Maybe some kids found this place and wanted to leave something spooky," I offered, trying to rationalize it. "You know, like an urban legend thing." "Maybe," Tyler said, but he didn't sound convinced. That's when we heard it. Footsteps below in the dry leaves surrounding the base of the trees. Someone was down there. Tyler immediately shut off his flashlight and motioned for me to do the same. We sat in darkness, barely breathing. The footsteps moved slowly around the blind, circling it. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet. The leaves crunched loudly with each step. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whoever was down there could hear it. Tyler pulled out his phone, turned the brightness all the way down, and opened the flashlight app, holding his thumb over the lens so only the faintest glow escaped. The footsteps stopped directly below us. I could hear breathing, heavy, labored breathing, like whoever it was had been running or was exerting themselves. Then a voice, a woman's voice, but wrong somehow, too flat, emotionless. "Someone's in my blind." Tyler and I looked at each other in the darkness. I could see his eyes wide with fear in the dim glow from his phone. The breathing continued below us. Then the ladder creaked. She was climbing up. Tyler moved fast. He grabbed the top rung of the ladder and tried to pull it away from the platform. But it was nailed to the tree. It wasn't going anywhere. "Hey," he shouted down. "This is private property. You need to leave." The climbing stopped. Silence for a moment. Then that flat voice again. "This is my blind. Mine. You're trespassing." "The hell you talking about?" Tyler's voice was steady, but I could hear the edge of panic. "My uncle owns this land. You're trespassing." "My blind," the voice repeated. "Get out." The ladder creaked again. She was still climbing. Tyler made a decision. He grabbed an old shotgun shell from the floor and threw it down as hard as he could. I heard it hit something, then a grunt of surprise. The climbing stopped. "We've got a rifle up here," Tyler lied. "You need to leave now, or I'm calling the sheriff." More silence. I could barely breathe. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped my flashlight. Then, finally, the sound of retreating footsteps, moving away from the blind, back into the woods. We waited, listening. The footsteps faded into the distance. We sat there in the dark for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes. Neither of us spoke. We were both listening, straining to hear if she was coming back. Finally, Tyler whispered, "We need to get back to camp. Now. What if she's still out there? We can't stay up here all night. We don't have any supplies, no water, no way to call for help. Signal's terrible out here. We have to risk it." He was right, but the thought of climbing down that ladder, of being vulnerable on the ground, terrified me. Tyler went first, moving as quickly and quietly as he could. When he reached the bottom, he turned on his flashlight, scanning the area. Clear, he whispered up to me. Come on. I climbed down, my legs shaking so badly I almost slipped twice. The second my feet hit the ground, Tyler grabbed my hand and we started moving. Not quite running, but walking as fast as we dared in the dark. Every sound made us jump. Every shadow looked like a person. The 10-minute walk back to camp took forever. When we finally saw the glow of our dying campfire, I wanted to cry with relief. Everything looked undisturbed. Tyler immediately started packing up our stuff by flashlight. What are you doing? I asked. We're leaving. Now. We're not spending the night here. I didn't argue. I helped him pack. We threw everything into his truck haphazardly, not even bothering to properly fold the tent. Within 15 minutes, we were driving down that dirt road, both of us checking the mirrors constantly to see if anyone was following. We didn't talk much on the drive back. Tyler was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. I kept playing it over in my mind. That voice, the way she'd said "my blind" with such certainty, such possessiveness. When we got back to Tyler's apartment, it was nearly 2 a.m. We were both exhausted, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her climbing that ladder, getting closer and closer to us in the dark. The next day, Tyler called his uncle to tell him what happened. His uncle was dismissive at first, said it was probably just a homeless person squatting on the property or something. But when Tyler described the voice, the way she acted, his uncle went quiet. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. Did she have long hair? Dark hair? I don't know, Tyler said. We never got a good look at her. It was too dark. Why? His uncle hesitated. There's been stories. Going back years, people who camp on that property sometimes report seeing a woman in the woods, usually at night. She never does anything, just watches. Some people think it's a ghost story, local legend type stuff. You never mentioned this before. Because I figured it was bullshit. People make up stories about every piece of woods. I've been hunting that land for 30 years and never seen anything. Well, someone was definitely there last night. And she wasn't friendly. His uncle said he'd checked the property, maybe put up some game cameras to see if anyone was regularly trespassing. He promised to call if he found anything. He never called. Tyler tried reaching out a few times over the next couple of weeks, but his uncle either didn't answer or gave vague responses about being busy. Eventually, Tyler stopped trying. We broke up a few months later for unrelated reasons, but I sometimes wonder if that night affected him the same way it affected me. If he still thinks about that voice in the dark, that flat, emotionless declaration of ownership. Last year, out of curiosity, I tried to look up the property. I wanted to see if there was any record of the place, any history that might explain what we encountered, but I couldn't find anything. I didn't remember the exact location well enough to search for it, and I wasn't about to reach out to Tyler to ask. But I did find something interesting. In the archives of a local Missouri newspaper from the 1970s, there was a brief article about a missing person, a woman who disappeared while hiking in the Ozarks. They'd found her campsite, but never found her. The article included a photo, dark hair, gaunt face, something about the eyes, even in that old grainy photograph, that looked empty. I closed my laptop and haven't searched for it again. Some things are better left unknown. The woods can hide many secrets, and some of them are better left undiscovered. When we venture into nature, we often forget that we're entering a space that belongs to something other than ourselves. And sometimes, Something out there doesn't want visitors. These stories remind us that even in our modern world, with all its technology and connectivity, there are still places where we can find ourselves truly alone, truly vulnerable. And in those moments, we learn what fear really means. If you have a true, original horror story that you'd like to submit to be featured in a future video, please email us at nightencountersstories@gmail.com. We read every submission and are always looking for new accounts of unexplained encounters, supernatural experiences, or terrifying moments of real danger. Thank you for watching Night Encounters. Stay safe out there, and remember, trust your instincts. They evolved for a reason.